I was ecstatic when Dying Light 2 was announced. The first game was a phenomenal and often terrifying experience. I had a few criticisms, especially around the grappling hook and camouflage abilities, but that was because I felt it did not play to the game's strengths and small tweaks would have fixed things. With Techland supporting Dying Light 1 well into the second game's development, I was quite hopeful they would be aware of those issues and really innovate on the game's mechanics. Originally meant to release in 2020, there was quite a delay, as it didn't actually release until early into 2022. That had me worried, but again, Techland continued working on 1, so I had faith. After now having played the game though, I find Dying Light 2 to be quite disappointing. I've heard many criticize the first game for having generic characters and story and such, but generic doesn't mean bad. Things might not be flashy, but everything was just good. I was quite impressed with the voice acting throughout, especially from Crane. I really appreciate a voice actor's ability to sell emotion without the audience ever seeing facial features. By pure voice alone, we always understood how Crane was feeling. It's a pretty basic plot, but I also found myself quite immersed in Haran. I did have my own criticisms, but I really do feel the game is great. Going into Dying Light 2, however, the way I describe it is more like Dying Light point 5. It often feels like they forgot what made the first game so great and kind of backtracked on so many of the core design features. The first and most defining feature of the first game was the day-night cycle. The nighttime is straight up terrifying. It's dark and zombies are more aggressive, but the real horror comes from the volatiles. Once it becomes night, the volatiles wander the streets. There is a constant danger from being out at night. And being chased by a volatile is one of the most horrifying, immersive, and exhilarating experiences in a video game that I've ever had. The encouragement for going out at night was double experience gains, but I admit that isn't a huge benefit. All the game needed was more incentive. Unfortunately, the essential selling point was neutered in 2. The first time I went out at night, I was thoroughly confused. They introduced new special infected, one being a howler, that is a bit of a trope in zombie games. A zombie that yells super loud and attracts more zombies. I preferred the screamers from 1 where they were zombie children that from a distance sounded like a regular crying child. Its screams did attract zombies, but the scream itself was also an attack. It was a fucked up but unique take on a trope. Anyway, the howler will, well, howl and attract zombies, and it gets the attention of virals, which begins a chase. There are multiple levels to a chase, which attracts more dangerous zombies. When going out at night, there are howlers that populate the streets, but aside from that, there is little danger. Essentially, howlers create chases, which is where the real danger is. I suppose if you make noise, you'll attract some virals, which could create a chase, but it's weird there is, in a sense, a prerequisite to danger. You almost have to go out of your way to get into any sort of problems at night, especially when running across the rooftops. Aside from randomly spawned encounters, the rooftops are essentially empty. Staying atop buildings, you will avoid basically any danger, and it doesn't feel any different than being out during the day. It takes a level 3 chase at least in order for volatiles to appear, which is so bizarre. The fact that volatiles prowled the streets is what made the night so terrifying and difficult to manage. Now even virals, basic running zombies, are few and far between. It makes the nighttime a complete joke. It's sad to see, because I really do think they just needed to boost the rewards a little bit and it would have been perfect, but they gutted it instead. The developers try to give you incentive to go out at night for most of the objectives through the world. Many buildings are open now, to at least some degree, and you can run through them. But during the day, most buildings are heavily occupied by zombies. They go out at night, making it more manageable. But all of the big zombies are out and about, now that it's night, so the buildings end up being basic as hell anyway. It's so strange. Speaking of these objectives, it's sad to see the game's world devolve into this repetitive checklist. There are so many of the same boring tasks over and over. GRE hospitals, subway stations, power substations, water towers, military supply vehicles, dark stores, windmills. Like, there is just so much repeated garbage. It gets old so fast. After the first one, you've basically done them all of the respective objective, but a lot of them give special items called inhibitors that are used to improve your character by granting more stamina or health. As one might expect, that's pretty valuable, especially because of how stamina works. Stamina is a little bar at the bottom of your screen that dictates how much you get to play the game. That's pretty much what it is. Now, seriously, stamina is used when fighting or performing most parkour. You know, the other big gimmick of the series. Any sort of traversal of the environment, even just hanging from a ledge and not moving, will use stamina. You don't lose stamina for running, but there is also no sprint button by default, and the character awkwardly has to wind up into a sprint every time you begin to move. It works essentially the complete opposite of the first game. In 1, you had a limited sprint duration before slowing down, but could do as much parkouring as you'd like. And when you leveled up the whole tree, you earned infinite sprinting, meaning by the end game you weren't really restricted at all. Unfortunately, here almost everything consumes your stamina, which does nothing but limit the player. Right away, even climbing some of the most basic environments is impossible. In the fucking tutorial, you can't climb out of an elevator shaft. Like, come on, what a joke. There is no reason why such a small climb should be hindered in a game centered around parkour. It purely restricts the player and gates them from content. Literally, at first, many objectives are impossible to complete because it requires specific amounts of stamina. The issue is exasperated by the fact that your stamina is shared for both movement and combat. So if you use too much stamina, both avenues of gameplay are shut down. That's why inhibitors are so important to get. You need stamina to get anything done. So you will do these brain-dead objectives just to get them. But this also means it's basically mandatory to just dump all of the inhibitors into stamina at first, and it's not really a choice between that and health. Who thought any of this was a good idea? I appreciate the attempt at iterating upon design, but there is some weight behind the phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Like with the game's combat. I initially liked what they were trying to go for with the combat in the game. In the first game, combat was pretty lackluster, but the physics engine made fighting zombies entertaining since they would go fucking flying. With human opponents though, things weren't as fun. Fortunately, guns made it manageable. Going into this game's tutorial, I liked seeing how combat had opened up significantly. The first thing we learn is that you can parry enemies, and if you do, you can disorient them, opening them up for your attacks. Or you can incorporate parkour into the combat, by using a stunned enemy as a springboard and kicking another enemy behind them. This really piqued my interest. Most human enemies in 1 were either gun encounters or slashing until they didn't parry you anymore. So I was pumped to see what kind of wacky ways I could approach combat. Unfortunately, things quickly turned out to be the opposite of what I expected. See, humans can block you too, of course, and will usually completely block or dodge all of your hits after only a swing or two. Now, this isn't some out-of-the-ordinary concept. Of course they will try to defend themselves. But the thing is, you are kind of stuck then. They block everything you do. So you kind of end up having to just wait for them to swing at you so it can be parried, and then you can hit them 2 or 3 times and repeat the process. You can charge up power swings to knock them out of their blocks, but humans usually come in packs, and you are always fighting a bunch of them at once, making it more difficult to do that. Human enemies became a huge chore to fight, and really slowed down the pacing every time I was forced into an encounter. It gets to the point where I wish I just had a gun again. That way I can just get the encounters over with. There is, of course, the zombies to fight too, at least when you remember they are even in the game. As I mentioned, the nighttime doesn't really feel as threatening because it's so easy to avoid chases. But the daytime? Oh boy is this fucking boring. Since most zombies are inside buildings, traversing the open world is pretty simplistic. There will occasionally be some zombies here and there, but rarely will it ever get in your way enough for you to even notice. Even when a field is flooded with them, I never felt the kind of threat that I experienced in the first game, where falling off a building could mean you were quickly surrounded. But I suppose when you are fighting the zombies, it's not that bad. They are punching bags for the most part, nothing to write home about. Unfortunately though, the physics were toned down heavily, so it's not as entertaining for me anymore. But I suppose it's alright, because why would you even need to fight half the time when you can just fly over the fucking city instead? Fuck me, man. The paraglider is the dumbest part of this game. One of my biggest gripes with the first game was the grappling hook. The issue was that it eliminated the risk of parkouring. You can skip traversing the environment and zip right to an area, taking away the chance of falling into a horde of zombies on the ground. Or, even if you did, you could zip right back up to the buildings in a second anyway. But it did not eliminate the parkour outright. It was just antithetical to the rest of the game up until that point of unlocking it. I felt with some small adjustments, it could have easily been balanced. And they kind of did that in this game. They introduced the grappling hook very late into the story, and it only acts like a rope that swings you from an area and not pulling you directly to it. I think this version is great, and it is completely undercut by the existence of the paraglider. Why in the actual fuck is there an option to fly? The paraglider absolutely destroys any need to parkour by simply flying over obstacles. But wait, you can't fly for real, you can only glide from area to area. Yeah, sure, but that's still ignoring obstacles. It's still just ignoring the need to parkour whatsoever. And you have all of these steam vents everywhere that jettison you into the air, and you can just chain them together to stay in the air for large amounts of time. This might be the dumbest thing in this game, and I haven't even gotten to the story yet. I do understand why it exists though. In the second part of the city, the buildings are much higher, and parkour would be difficult. So, they give us a way to glide from very tall buildings, and safely traverse in that way. However, it didn't need to be built like that. Nobody forced them to make the game take place with fucking skyscrapers or anything. Look at the first game. It took place in a poor, run-down area of Harran. They chose a landscape that fit the gameplay they were building. They could have just made a different environment to more suit parkour, but instead they created a solution to a manufactured problem and then destroyed their parkour at the same time. Just, wow. Again, I appreciate them trying new things, but at the same time, you can't just do whatever and expect it to work. It's pretty noticeable with stuff like the RPG elements. Like, was it really necessary for there to be gear in the game that takes place in first person and you can never actually see your character outside of a menu? It certainly wasn't necessary for the stats, because they are so minuscule that I don't know why you'd care. And while we're at it, what did it add to my gameplay to require my consumables to be upgraded 9 fucking times each to be at max capacity? Why? This includes healing, by the way. Your slow-ass healing needs to be upgraded or else it barely heals you at all in the late game. The first game had it heal a set amount, and it was easy and quick. Now, the basic heal takes 75.5 fucking years to get done. Techland, you made a game based around quick parkour and moment-to-moment decisions. The last thing I want to do is stop doing that. Stop slowing me down for no reason. You already limit me with the garbage stamina bar. Why do you need unnecessarily slow, basic, boring healing items? Yeah, there is a quicker shot that you can take, but then why wasn't that just the go-to instead of this trash? The first game's strength was simplicity. Many might want more flashy and innovative design, but simple isn't bad. I find it's often when things get complicated for no reason, that's when issues form, where they didn't need to be. I know I've been shitting all over this game the entire time, and it's mainly because of how much I loved the first game. But let's look at something I think is actually pretty good. That's the stealth. While the objectives littered through the city get old real fast, I will say the stealth objectives were probably the most fun for me. Having to sneak around zombies and finding the right pathways in dark areas enhanced the horror aspect. Despite stealth being the polar opposite of the fast-paced nature of the parkour, it was enjoyable if I looked at it as its own thing. Light could become all the more valuable in these environments, allowing you to see where you need to go, but if used too much, it would wake the sleeping zombies around you. I tend to like stealth, and it provides a sort of challenge for me. I attempt to make it through stealth sections in games without being seen and will restart if I am seen, but that's just me. The layouts weren't that drastically different from each area, but they could still prove to be nice mazes and challenges for you. Well, until you realize there's no point, and just run in swinging and slaughter everything anyway. Yeah, even when I praise the game, I'm gonna still end up criticizing it, because it's just so mind-numbingly dumb. You know those inhibitors I mentioned earlier? Remember when I said it boosts your stamina, and how stamina was shared for parkour and combat? So after you dump tons of inhibitors into stamina just so you can play the damn game, you are flooded with stamina for combat too. After I realized I could swing most weapons for seemingly ever without running out of stamina, I just ran head first into these dark areas and just fucked up every zombie I saw without thinking about anything. Especially in the GRE hospitals. Funneling a horde into a small doorway let my swings do massive area damage to everything around me. Maybe you won't want to do this on higher difficulties, but why would you want to play on higher difficulties? Oh boy, they have bigger health bars. So interesting.
Figure it out. That's what I say. So figure it out.
Alright, so before I talk about the story, let's look at our skill trees real quick. You have the combat tree and parkour tree, with abilities and upgrades meant for each type of gameplay. There are some noticeable differences between these trees and those in the first game. The first is that the progress made through the trees is more horizontal rather than vertical. What I mean by that is that as long as you have the proper health and stamina levels, you can unlock any skill on the tree and it branches horizontally outward. This lets you focus on getting what you want. You can access the very bottom of the trees almost immediately, with the only restriction being that you need to get the inhibitors, which you'll already be getting because you need the stamina as is. It is an interesting change, and I like how it lets you customize your experience a bit more. However, a side effect of this is that I didn't really feel encouraged to get the points to level up the tree. Once I get the abilities I wanted, it was kind of an afterthought. The first game's trees encourage you to progress. You unlocked better and better stuff as you went along. But neither way is really inherently better, I just thought I'd talk about it. The biggest change, though, is the lack of a third skill tree. In 1, you also had the survivor tree. It focused on upgrades to your equipment and survival abilities, like the camouflage ability. The way you got experience for this tree was through quests and getting airdrops. There was a lot of incentive to do side quests and other objectives because the survivor tree got you so many cool, fun, and useful tools. Additionally, dying would result in the loss of some of your experience in the tree until it was finished. This created consequence for death aside from just time lost. Not the best or most interesting, but still a consequence. But none of this exists in 2. Your overall level is determined by how many inhibitors have been used, and any bonus tools are locked behind story progression. The paraglider and grappling hook and even the UV flashlight require story progress, while other things like camouflage just don't exist. While having this tree isn't a requirement, of course, the result is that there are many less reasons to actually engage in the content. Doing quests give experience for my other 2 trees, but as I mentioned, I didn't care because I had the abilities I needed by a certain point. Gear rewards are worthless, so that didn't interest me either. So outside of inhibitors, which directly equated to power, I didn't have a reason to engage with most of the activities in the world and most of the side quests. Even dying was kind of forgetful. As weird as it sounds, I felt dying was too forgiving. Often falling off a building and dying was more beneficial for me because it would reset my position and put me back where I wanted to be. I didn't like the loss of survivor points from death because you could lose abilities you unlocked, but not having any penalty at all isn't the answer. It gives me more incentive to just bulldoze my way through content rather than bother with the objectives. Overall, gameplay is pretty hollow. They gutted the danger of the night, reuse the same objectives ad nauseum, lock your ability to play behind inhibitors while removing incentives to engage in the content. I mean, seriously, what happened? News shouldn't come at the cost of what already works. This is especially true with the story. It's time we finally got to it, and I'll be upfront, this game's story is a dumpster fire. So, the story follows Aiden, the courier, pilgrim, that travels the land and delivers messages between settlements. He supposedly is a great pilgrim because he is notoriously faster and stronger than others. Apparently, he was experimented on when he was a kid. He ends up traveling to Villador in search of his sister Mia. Right before entering the city, he is bitten and infected, because of course he is. Once in the city, he has to run down leads to find his sister, while also helping either of the 2 factions of the city, and eventually confronting the insane renegades and their leader, Waltz. Dialogue plays a huge role as you traverse the story, or at least it tries to. Basically, everybody you talk to will provide dialogue options. Most of them are either just getting more general details about a quest, or simply fluff. Occasionally, there will be branching choices that impact the ending you get. Unfortunately, outside of the ending, we have another case of choices making virtually no real impact on the events of the game. The game wants you to decide between helping the Peacekeepers, this military-like force that wants to instill order, and the survivors, the assholes that tried to hang Aiden the moment they saw him. Right off the bat, we have the game proposing a choice of sorts, but the narrative doesn't support this at all. Aiden is here to find his sister, not pick sides in a conflict. Why would he get wrapped up in the conflict? Initially, Aiden works with both sides because he is just trying to do whatever he can to achieve his goal, as you'd expect. But then the game starts to push you to make a decision on who you want to side with, but they also don't give you a reason to care about the decision either. I kind of defaulted to the Peacekeepers, because everybody I met on the Survivor side was just a complete twat. Unfortunately, siding with the Peacekeepers didn't really end up changing what would have happened. There is this one mission where you will attack a fort of renegades and save the leader of the survivors, Carl. After saving him, he tells us to go meet up with his sister, Sophie, at her safe house. When going the Peacekeeper route, you don't go to Sophie. But here's the weird thing. You also never see Carl again. I just saved the guy, and he vanishes. But then there must be something on the survivor side of the story, right? I mean, that's kind of irrelevant though, because there should still be an overall understanding of what's going on. From my point of view, this Carl guy got Control-Alt-Deleted out of the game after that cutscene. As the leader of the survivors faction, it's quite strange he isn't brought up again. What was the point of giving people a choice on what side they want to choose, and then moving on like nothing ever happened to such a degree that the leader of the opposing faction is never seen again? What the actual fuck? This game is littered with just the strangest shit. Another example is later on in the game, Aiden is looking for an ex-GRE scientist who could potentially help him find Mia. Apparently, she was living with the survivors this whole time. Well, considering I sided with the Peacekeepers, that should make things more difficult for me, right? If I was friends with the survivors, obviously I'd just walk into town and talk to her. One and done. So, obviously as their enemy, I'd have to work harder to get to this person. No, of course not. Why would you think something so silly? Aiden returns to the survivors' town to find it wrecked and most people dead. Turns out the Peacekeepers ransacked the town. Did we get a choice to try and stop it? Did we get forced to participate? No, it just happened randomly. Oh well, Sophie is seemingly the only survivor when we arrive, although she is injured. She starts to give Aiden quite a lot of shit, talking down on him for siding with the Peacekeepers. Aiden says his goal from the beginning was only to find his sister, not fight in the conflict, which is fucking true. Aiden never signed up for their cause, but Sophie is a twat along with the rest of her twat town, and I still haven't forgotten that they tried to hang Aiden. Anyway, after some nonsense dialogue, she, and I shit you not, just tells Aiden where to find the woman he is looking for. Fucking what? Just like that? She just gives Aiden the information anyway? Then what the fuck was the point of all of this? The game just makes you run all the way to this town just for her to give you the information away for free. Like, you could have just given this over the radio instead of wasting my time. It's fucking embarrassing! So, siding with a faction amounts to fuck all. You decided what the people wear in the random safe zones you unlock. That's it, really. You get gameplay bonuses for giving sections of the city to either faction, so you will likely decide based on that and not really anything to do with the events of the story. And once again, the whole point of Aiden's journey is to find Mia, and the conflict between the factions has nothing to do with that, so I don't know why it was forced so heavily. It's almost like the decision was to make the game more RPG-like, and they pushed everything else into the criteria without making it properly fit. Unfortunately, it's going to get a lot worse. The characters in this game are absolute clowns. As annoying as Sophie is, her brother is a million times worse. You meet him on a mission where you were trying to save him. Instead of accepting your help, he's a massive dick, and more worried about these crystals that people are superstitious about. The jackass gets other people killed in this grandiose crystal heist, and then the game acts like he was the good guy and looking out for his people. Remind me again why I'd ever side with these degens? Speaking of degens, there is Lawan, and what a fucking degen she is. Lawan is an asshole from start to finish. She saves us from the bad guy Waltz, and after escaping, there's a little chat. Aiden has a fucking seizure or something and passes out moments after she walks away. She radios him and says she thought he bailed. But you were here, like 10 seconds ago. That means either Aiden was out for a long time, and Lawan never checked to see what happened after he didn't follow her out of the building, or it really was 10 seconds ago, and this wet sock couldn't be bothered to walk 30 feet backwards to check on him. We are off to a fantastic start. As we continue through the game, she never becomes likable in any way. At one point, Aiden is going through a tall building filled with dangerous infected so that he can restore the city's radio communication. After the peacekeepers he goes up there with get killed, he runs through this tower by himself and managed to accomplish the goal. This task was previously attempted by a group called the Night Runners, whom nearly all died because it was that dangerous. Lawan finds out and yells at Aiden and eventually follows him. So yeah, I understand someone being worried about Aiden due to the nature of the job. However, first Lawan just fucking shows up at the end without any explanation of how she got here. The bottom part of the building is controlled by the peacekeepers, and the rest is filled with dangerous infected whom Aiden barely snuck by as is. How the fuck did Lawan just go through all of that in record time if an entire group of legendary Night Runners couldn't do it? And then she scolds Aiden at the top of the building, as if he didn't just do something amazing for the people of the city. Furthermore, what does she have to scold him on if she just did the same thing with apparent ease? After this, she demands we go get her replacement shoes since hers tore on the way up. The mission gives us a little bit more details about her past, to which I couldn't give two shits about because Lawan has the audacity to send us to get fucking shoes after everything that just happened. I cannot stand her as a character. But there is somebody I hate even more, and it's Waltz. He is the main antagonist of the game, and also likely one of the biggest wastes of potential I've ever seen. I've heard people complain Rise was a generic and boring villain, but Waltz takes the cake there. He is literally a mustache-twirling villain for 90% of the story. Initially, Aiden is given a GRE key thing by somebody who turned against Waltz's gang of renegades. After giving it to Aiden, Waltz ends up killing the guy, because we have to know he's the bad guy, of course. But Waltz needs the key, so hunts Aiden down for it. Eventually, Aiden does confront him about Mia, to which Waltz gets superpowers and beats the shit out of him and some peacekeepers. After chasing him, Aiden is still just beaten up by Waltz. But then, Waltz recognized Aiden from the experiments done on him as a child. This is where Lawan shows up and shoots Waltz, but he again gets superpowers and Aiden has to run away. Meanwhile, this is like the halfway point through the game, and the primary villain has been seen for like 3 minutes total. We don't see Waltz again for quite a while, until Aiden is exploring an old GRE facility. Despite Waltz knowing who Aiden is now, he just doesn't care. Are we going to talk about anything? Are we going to have a discussion about what Waltz did to Aiden as a child? The experiments did something, because Aiden gets superpowers too and goes somewhat feral, but Waltz just doesn't care. The next time Waltz is seen is the very end of the game. Out of nowhere, Waltz is thrown a ton of character. Spoilers or whatever, but Mia isn't Aiden's sister. She is actually Waltz's daughter. Wow. He was experimenting on people years prior because Mia has an illness of some kind and wanted to save her. The hints towards this is that in all of Aiden's flashbacks, everybody has shaved heads when Mia doesn't, implying she was different from the other kids. So we went this entire game where Waltz was doing all of these terrible mustache-twirling villain things, but actually, he was doing it for his daughter. Oh, look at that. He's really a caring father. Isn't that nice? Well, it would be, if I gave a shit. You can't go dozens upon dozens of hours of gameplay, providing me with virtually nothing on a character, and expect me to care in the slightest when there is a development shoved in at the very end. It only creates so many questions on why this wasn't addressed sooner. Aiden looked at Mia as his sister through his warped memory from his trauma. Waltz knew from back then that they were close and seemingly cared for him. When he recognized Aiden midway through the game, one might expect him to attempt to talk, maybe explain to him the situation, explain Mia's condition. Aiden could be given the choice to help Waltz in saving Mia. The game is so heavy on throwing RPG elements at us. Meanwhile, this would have been the perfect way to create choices and branching paths. But at the very least, Waltz should have made an attempt to communicate, especially after he saw how Aiden was getting superpowers too. That would mean his experiments years ago bore some success, and he could try to get Aiden to help save Mia. Instead, the developers went with nothing. Literally nothing. At least in 1, we learned a little bit about Rise and how he lost his brother in the outbreak, and how he blamed the GRE. At least there was something to work with. Meanwhile, Waltz has nothing until the very end of the game. It's pretty pathetic. I could keep going, but I think everybody gets the point by now. I said it before, but Dying Light 2 really feels more like Dying Light 0.5. Techland neutered their own game by not understanding what made it so special. They toned down the nighttime threats and required prerequisites to even encounter dangerous zombies. They destroyed the atmosphere by having most zombies locked inside during the day. They filled the world with meaningless and repeated objectives. They slowed down the player's ability to play the game or finish objectives by locking their progress behind stamina improvements. They didn't learn how the grappling hook devalued their parkour from the first game, and made it worse with the paraglider, letting players completely avoid parkour and zombies. They shove RPG elements all throughout the game when they didn't need to be there. And it's surrounded by horrible characters and story writing. You can still enjoy the game, and I imagine many have tons of fun with it, but it's a hollow shell compared to its predecessor. At the end of the day, Dying Light 2 is just so disappointing.